welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. And in this episode, we're going to handle that famous Akeda story, which is the verb to bind in Hebrew, or the story of, in Genesis 22, Abraham's near sacrifice of his son Isaac. So I think this will take our entire hour, Mike. So let's go ahead and jump in. But before we do, I'd love to hear how your demon intensive went. I know that your going into demon studies is something that obviously is taking a lot of your time, and I'm curious if it matches a lot of other folks wondering if this is the kind of thing they would be good for, and so kind of pull back the curtain and let us know, what do you do in a doctoral intensive, or in your case at Gordon, how does the doctoral program work?
So the Doctor of Ministry program at Gordon, the one I'm doing in particular is in preaching, and there's even like a subtitle to it, from study to the pulpit. And one of the reasons I was drawn to it was, well, there are several reasons. One big reason was one of my favorite professors, Dr. Jeffrey Arthurs, is the overseeing professor for it. A really great guy, really good communicator, and he just simply threw that out in one of the classes that I took with him, that he was leading this doctorate program. And there was even a side benefit that if I completed this doctorate program, I could also jump right into later a master's of theology program, where the time is reduced, the credits required would be reduced. And this was near the end of my MDiv career at Gordon. I was doing my last semester at Gordon, and I just thought, well, let me just give it a try. I didn't know if anything would come of it. And so I applied, did all the application stuff, and to my surprise, they accepted me. And so it's now been 2 years, and I just recently finished the most recent cohort residency on campus at Gordon. It's been a really good experience. And one of the things I've discovered about the preaching doctorate, at least, is it's a very interdisciplinary practice. So I get to still dive into good biblical studies, biblical theology, and at the same time touch upon systematic theology, but also touch upon preaching hermeneutics, homiletics, like all these things that I really do love and enjoy. And I get to actually play with all of these disciplines at the same time in this doctorate. And so one of my hopes with this is that I'll be better trained as a preacher, but also to be a better teacher. I think that's one of the really advantages of doing that, was learning from not only my professor, but also from my cohort mates. Because, and here's the funny thing for us, when we were catching up on the first day, we all realized that we're not just bivocational folks. All of us are trivocational. And
right.
It was just hilarious. We started realizing, like, wait a minute, Mike, you're doing this, this, and this. It's like, yeah, and you're doing this and this and this. It was just like, we're all really busy. And the demon program, at least the way it is done at Gordon, it is purposely crafted in a way to enable people who have full-time jobs to be able to still do their full-time jobs or full-time ministries or whatever, and just know that they can plan. You got to do this 2-week intensive, but the rest of the year is your own study, your own research, your own preparation for your projects and your dissertation eventually. I'm just happy that finally I can officially say I'm a doctorate candidate. And
what is and again, I'm thinking of this question in terms of the listener, what is the requirement academically to get into a demon program in general? Besides Gordon, I'm sure Gordon would be pretty normal as far as what the requirements are. Is it an academic? Is it like a BA, or is it a master's? What do they require?
So they do require a master's in some sort of discipline. So it could be a master's of theology, master's of counseling, master's of divinity. As long as at a master's level. And this was why I was unsure if I would be accepted. I just thought, okay, I'll give it a try. And part of that was there's almost like an expectation, because Doctor of Ministry degree generally means you're going to be a teaching practitioner, right? And so one of the things they would want to see from you is that you have had some sort of general experience in the doctorate that you're applying for. And so I have done preaching before. I had done some like a preaching series on Job with my church and my other pastors and every so often, but I couldn't say that I've been doing it like for years. I've been doing it for only a few years, and I wasn't sure if they would actually take me in. But they still took me in.
And they took you for what reason, do you think? I mean, be humbly honest here, but looking at Mike Chu's resume again for the sake of the listener, what was it about yours that they said, yeah, let's take him?
I honestly think a lot of that has to do with, well, one, Dr. Arthur's, like he knew of my work of being in his class before. So I think one, that was what impressed him, but also, I think the application also required garnering recommendations or kind of essays written up by my pastors and by some of my closest friends, so that they can also kind of figure out what's the character of this person. And so whatever my pastors and then one of my closest friends, whatever they wrote was something that contributed at least to them wanting to extend that invitation for me to join the program. It's because I'm comparing myself to like my other cohort mates. There's no way you cannot do something like that. And every one of them is like been a long-term like practitioner of preaching. Like they're all like either full-time pastors, part-time pastors, vocational pastors. They have a full-time job, but they do preaching every Sunday. So like in comparison,
do you feel like you're keeping up with them? I mean, do you, and again, this is kind of getting behind the curtain on your mental state here, but I remember sitting in doctoral classes the first time thinking, what am I doing here? I mean, because I was in Old Testament classes, but I wasn't an Old Testament guy. Then I would go to a New Testament class, and I'm not a New Testament guy. I'm a Bible exposition guy. So you're always in these classes of specialists, and it drives you, crazy thinking, how can I compete with even the guys in the room, let alone the program in general. So how is that striking you?
I think at least within my doctorate, so yes, like I can totally see everyone else has way more experience than me. They've technically preached more sermons than I have ever preached, and yet I think we all came into the program realizing we really didn't know as much as we all thought that we knew.
Yeah,
and so I think that was a little bit of humble pie, but it was also just, the graciousness of our professor. He brought in also a co-teaching professor for the first year, and the same thing again this year. And it really was just more an atmosphere and really an attitude of, let's have dialogue, discussion, let's collaborate together. How can we help one another in our practice of preaching? And sometimes we would do a practice sermon or we would present a sermon, and part of that exercise is we receive the feedback as well from our fellow cohort mates and my professors, so that we can kind of note, all right, I need to work on this part, or they noticed this, or I forgot to say something. And it was always like constructive, feedback. And so I think that's just been one of the cool things that I've really enjoyed about this program. And just, I've been happy being a Gordon Conwell guy. It's been a good experience.
And I will tell you, and you've heard this maybe said to you, but I learned it very much on the ground, that you learn much more after you're done, because you're so involved in the texts and looking at the gravel on the road again, that analogy, that looking up and looking at the road is going to be something you get to do the rest of your life. But right now you're stuck inspecting gravel. So welcome to that world. It's fun. And I'm sure you can't wait to get done at the same time. So, well, let's jump into Genesis 22. Let's just do it. And what I'd like to do is, we all know the story. Abraham is told by God to kill his son. He obeys. But at the last second, a divine being shouts out of heaven, "Stop." And I'm so glad he told him to stop when he did, right? I always have this mental picture of Abraham not hearing him or thinking it was a twig breaking or something and it was too late. But the story is he stops. He then sees a nearby ram and sacrifices it instead. So we'll read through the story and make comments as we go. Here are some questions I'd like to pursue while we're reading the story, and I'll stop and think about them as we go. Number one, why would Yahweh tell a person to kill his son? Especially when we have so many texts, and I'll mention them later, that say that's wrong. Okay. Secondly, why would Abraham obey? Especially after he had, back in Genesis 18, complained that God would destroy Sodom. 3, was Abraham's obedience required for his covenant with Yahweh to remain intact? In other words, was Abraham's covenant with Yahweh conditioned upon his obedience in this story specifically? 4, is there a special, something special about this location called Moriah in the text? And then 5, and we'll end with this, is the substitution portrayed here a possible, probable, even ideal meaning to give to Jesus' death on the cross in the New Testament? All right, 22:1, let's just jump in. Now it came to pass after these things that the Elohim, the article is there, so the God, and from everything we can tell, even though it doesn't say Yahweh tested him, when we have that phrase, the Elohim, of course, we're asking which one. Everything we can tell is this is Yahweh. So I've test-driven the idea that this is another Elohim coming to him, but the whole story is predicated on the idea that he obeyed Yahweh. So my suspicion is that even though the text is a bit ambivalent, and Hebrew scholars are not missing this, that the story begins with the Elohim telling Abraham somehow, to go, and he does. But my guess is, from everything I can tell in the text, just if anyone's curious, I don't sense the text works unless this is Yahweh. Okay. He says to him, Abraham, and he says, here I am, which is a way in Hebrew of saying yes. It's fascinating to me that the Hebrew language had not developed the word yes yet. No is, low. Today they say ken in Hebrew when you're on the bus and is that a bathroom? Ken. So now we have a word for yes, but in the biblical text, what they have to do is repeat the question in the indicative, or say, here I am, which would be the equivalent. Anyway, verse 2, he said, take now your son. This is Yahweh talking. And take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Isn't that interesting? He tosses that in there. Mm-hmm. By the way, I know you love him. Go to the land of Moriah. Now, it doesn't say which, hill, but this is the tradition that Moriah is Jerusalem and the area upon which Solomon will build the temple later. And offer him there as a burnt offering. Now, that's a very general term. It's not a penitential offering. It's not a sin offering, trespass offering. It just seems to be throw the whole thing. Listening to Dr. Sklar on this, and the idea of a burnt offering often is just the idea of an exclamation point on worship. Mm-hmm. That if I'm going to worship a deity, I show him how much I love him by putting something, whether it be an animal or grain or whatever it is, and burn up the whole thing on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men. Na'ar is the word, and the reason I bring that up is because Isaac will be called a Na'ar as well. So the age of Isaac is never brought up in the text. He is called a young boy. Mm-hmm. Because that's the general term, Na'ar in Hebrew. Josephus has him, I wrote that down somewhere, at 25. Again, how does Josephus know? We don't know how old he is. He's old enough to carry wood. So that's enough, or all we can say about the age of his son. 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him, the Elohim had told him. Then on the 3rd day, so this is not an incidental. I mean, I think the 3rd day is put in there both for historical accuracy, moving from, I think they're down in Beersheba, yeah, and they're going up to Moriah, which would be about a 20-30 mile, journey. Mm-hmm. And so it takes 3 days, a lot of time for him to think. The story is told with a sense of drama intact, right? It just keeps us moving through the story without a lot of emotional detail. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place, the place afar off. Abraham said to his young men, there's that Na'ar again, stay here with the donkey, the lad, the Na'ar, and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Again, Jewish and Christian commentators are curious. Does Abraham at this point express faith or belief that the event itself will not happen? Hebrews 11 gives the sense, and I don't know if the writer of Hebrews is saying he has extra revelation on this matter, that when he said this, or the story runs with the idea that Abraham is talking as though the event either will not happen or his death will be reversed. He'll be able to be resurrected and come back down the hill. Another way of thinking of this, and of, again, so many commentators on this story, is that what else would you have expected him to say? Would he have told the young men what's happening? Probably not. Would he have told Isaac what's happening? Possibly not. So I don't read a lot into verse 5. If a person wants to, and Mike, you're the preacher, so I think you have the right in a sermon moment to editorialize and enjoy the story. Theologically, personally, I kind of let this go. I don't know. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, actually, I'm kind of curious. I think if I did want to just kind of pause on the moment on the fact that Genesis 22:1 does start with the Ha Elohim, the God. A lot of my thoughts in the recent years have been about this passage has been shaped, honestly, by Dr. Richard Milton's book, Abraham's Silence. It's
okay.
It's been a very curious journey for me, and I'm really eager to find out like a little bit more details like from him as he continues this research. But one of the things he mentions about Genesis 22:1 is that he does agree. He thinks that ultimately the God is in reference to Yahweh, but he notes that this is a very strange moment for this to appear all by itself at the beginning of the story. Right. And it is. And lexically, it's odd. Yeah, it is odd. And so he points out some other scholars and research from other Jewish and Christian scholars. And one guy named Thomas Romer, he points out that the word Ha Elohim, the God, it is common in the book of Ecclesiastes and other later biblical texts, and quote, is used to denote a God that dwells far away from humans and appears to be incomprehensible. Okay. The same it may emphasizes, hold true. In other words, the divine distance between human and man. Yeah. So here he says the same may hold true for Genesis 22, and continues that he suggests that the deity is to convey, yes, that distance. And so it could be rendered, this verse, after these things, the deity tested Abraham. Like there is some sort of purposeful distance that's being placed by the narrator between Yahweh and Abraham. And so there's an ominous feel to the text because it starts off that way. Yep. And here's it. We can even bring up, this question. One of those questions I was asking. I'm not sure where this fits into those questions that I've opened with, but Maimonides, the medieval Spanish rabbi that I just love reading. He's so thoughtful. He says that God tested, in other words, as Jews have historically and Christians looked at this text wondering all these questions about it, the question of why would God do this, Maimonides' response was that God tested Abraham because, and I'm paraphrasing, he knew he would pass the test. In other words, the emphasis on the story, as you start the story and you're flummoxed, you're frustrated, you're horrified, frankly, that Abraham would even raise a knife over his son. Maimonides' point was, well, the point of the story is the obedience. The point of it is. So don't take the rest of it and be overly bothered emotionally, theologically even, by what you see, as much as know that by the end of the story, when you're walking back down the mountain, Abraham has now become a sign to the nations. That's a quote from Maimonides, that here is a man who is ready to give his life to the deity. Again, we're talking Yahweh, but thank you. And I should let you keep going with Middleton's work there if you'd like. Is there anything else you want to add before we
keep going with verse 6.
The little comment of God saying that of your son, your only one whom you love, like that is also a strange phrase. And again, this is a little bit of from some of the exegetical work that Middleton did. He pointed out that the word love, or ahev, in all of its other occurrences, besides one moment, it's a word that often has a negative connotation because of the context it's used. It often appears in moments between family members where there is some sort of favoritism, and a kind of favoritism that actually is very detrimental to the family. And so there's also, again, it adds to the tension of the narrative. They're like, yes, this is the son whom you love. It's as though like there's almost like you do love Isaac, right? And there's something strange going on in the text.
Yeah. Why would you have to bring that up, God? I know I love him, and you know that I love him. Why do you have to tell me that I know that I love him? You know, that's added, I think, for the drama of the story. So, as one Jewish commentator says, God often asks of man in every age to give up that which he loves the most. So, I think we're supposed to catch that. We're not supposed to miss that on the way.
Yeah, so. I think that there's something more going on there, though, because Middleton thinks that there's more of a rhetorical force of not just stating a fact that Abraham, of course, you love Isaac, so that we add the emotional drama, but it's also more of there could be the force of you love him, don't you? And so there's that little thing that it's building into. Okay, this is strange. We have the God, and then this God is saying this interesting phrase of you love him. And so it leaves us as wondering, he should love him. He ought to be loving him. What is going on? And so anyways, we can continue, but I just wanted to bring those little tidbits up because I think those are indications something really odd and something weird is happening within this story.
Yeah. And we should say, by the way, there is no third person with a tape recorder following behind these two. This is a story that's now been told orally, I'm sure, over time. And Abraham came back, and I'm sure Isaac told this story to his kids many times. So this is the result of the writer, be it Moses and editors that followed him, replaying a story in the text for us to enjoy that's going to keep the salient elements. And I've said this before, and I'll say it through much of my own theological teaching, wherever it might be, that the inspiration of the Bible to me is especially poignant on the story level. Mm-hmm. In other words, can a person go in and find textual problems in the Masoretic or LXX? Sure. That's a given. The question is, how do we think of inspiration then, which is a theological term, it's not a textual term, is to me, is the story true? And if the story's true, that atheist that I know, like I've told the story of him, us debating in classrooms and things, what really annoys him is the idea that the Bible is true even on a story level. In other words, does Jonah actually happen? Does a fish eat? And the reason that's out of my mind is I'm going deep sea fishing in a couple of weeks down in Florida. So my wife is, she has Jaws in her mind that there's going to be this big, fish coming behind the boat, eat a third of the boat off, and I'm going to fall in and get eaten by sharks. So that's her fear right now. Well, maybe I'm overestimating it a little bit, but I was wondering, that story of a whale picking up someone, is that possibly true? And you know what I found myself saying, and I hope I'm not offending people but I don't really care if it's true or not. It's in the story of Scripture, and I'm going to take it as that, whether it happened, possibly, probably. I'm not doubting that God can do anything. The question is, was the intent of the story of Jonah, for example, to teach us something? And by the end of Jonah 4, we know what the story's about. It's not about a whale. It's about, Assyrians, Ninevites repenting to Yahweh, and God accepting their repentance. So, in other words, the point of the story is enough to drive an atheist crazy. right? And whether or not the story actually happened. So when I found my atheist friend picking at the gravel on the road in front of my students, I liked to remind him that really what we're after here is the story of Scripture true? Because if it is, I win the debate. I'm not out for points, but I'm saying that the issue of inspiration can land on the level of the story, and I think even be more powerful. So I bring all that back into this, that Genesis 22, whether every line said on our English page was said by Abraham or Isaac is not as important to me as what is God teaching me through this story that Israelites, that Jews have revered over their history. So
sure.
I apologize for the aside, but that to me is something I'm always thinking of when I'm reading a text like this. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son. He took the fire in his hand and the knife, and two of them went together. Isaac said, verse 7, to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Another way of saying yes. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Great question. Again, if you're listening to this, you're caught in the story. And Abraham said, my son, Elohim will provide, no article, Elohim will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. Again, you got to wonder, is he presuming a story ahead of time? Is he just saying, we'll see? I don't know, but that's enough for me to keep reading, I guess. And the two of them went together, and they came to the place of which the Elohim had told him. So somehow he knows, and this is, I think, a valuable thing to stop and say, how does he know that God's wanting him to do it? And the quick answer is, I don't know. There must have been some revelation here between him and the Elohim that he has objective knowledge as to where to start and stop and, that whole thing. Mm-hmm. And Abraham built an altar. Now that's, again, let's watch how that works. Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son. Again, imagine that. He's old enough to carry the wood and now old enough to probably run from his father or at least fend him off, but he doesn't. This story says as much about Isaac as it is about Abraham in one sense, and Jews have not missed that. Laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Let's pause at that moment again. Go back to that question. Why would Yahweh tell a person to kill their son? The texts are, about a dozen. Can I list a few of them? I'm not going to turn to them, but again, if anybody wants to keep track. Deuteronomy 12:31, just a clear statement, do not kill do not kill children in sacrificial means. Repeated in Deuteronomy 18:10, Leviticus 18:21, and then 20 verse 2, Exodus 22 verses 29 to 30, Jeremiah. Now this is at the end of the Old Testament story, and there's where God is looking back upon, Jeremiah is looking back upon the slaying of children, Jeremiah 7 verses 30 to 32. We have a story in 2 Kings of a foreign king, chapter 3, who kills his son in a moment of a military battle, and he seems to do it sacrificially so that his deity will help him win the war. Fascinating story, but that's a child sacrifice. Ezekiel 20 verses 25 and 26 allude to it, again going over to Persia or Babylon, where they will be doing this sort of thing. So my point being, I think, and I don't have an answer as much as it leads me to a second question, and that is, why would Abraham obey, right? But the quick answer to why would Yahweh tell a person to kill their son? Well, we know that that at a later point in the story, at least a later point, by Deuteronomy 12, for example, which is 500 years away, that Moses will be told, you do not do this. This will be something you do not do. And it's said in relation to the nations doing it. And so my guess to answer the question, why would Yahweh tell a person to kill their son, is because at this point in the story, Abraham apparently is listening to a deity waiting for knowledge about what that deity is still like to some degree? Does he know what Yahweh is like? I think he's getting to know him. But to be fair with the, left to right version of the story as we have it, here's the question, the operative question in my mind. Does the command to kill your son by this deity strike you as wrong yet? Or is it simply the call of a deity upon a human? And I'm leaning toward the latter. So that, yes, we will find out later in the story that Yahweh would be opposed to this. But my guess is that at this point in the story, Abraham does not know that his deity is opposed to child sacrifice, as he later will find out. Is that making sense? Because other, like I say, other cultures, child sacrifice is part of their culture. So could it be that Abraham is coming from a culture where child sacrifice is, as deplorable as it is part of that religion?
Yeah, it's
any thoughts there, Mike?
I would agree. I think, and you're kind of matching a little bit up with where Milton also landed with this whole question: why would God ask of something of this, and why would Abraham not question it? It's because this was a common practice amongst the other deities of Mesopotamia and Canaan. That he writes requires that child sacrifice was a symbol of allegiance, and so the question is almost in Abraham's mind. So is this God? Is he different? Is he a God of mercy and love, or is he similar to the other gods of the other nations? And this is a part of like where Middleton's work is going. That why he even titled the book Abraham's Silence is that it is disturbing that if readers are following along with us, Abraham hasn't said much of anything until Isaac spoke up, and there is this weird silence that is going on, and so Middleton asks the question, what does the silence of Abraham possibly could mean? And he actually thinks it's a continuation of what happened after Genesis 18, that, with the whole entire intercession for Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of Lot, and yet Abraham stops at 10 people and he doesn't continue it on. He suggests Abraham's silence speaks of a God, at least from Abraham's perspective, is as though this is looking from how is Abraham possibly viewing God, because he still hasn't fully understood it. He suggests that Abraham's silence speaks of God as a harsh taskmaster who is not to be challenged. Like that's the assumption almost from Abraham's mind. He told me to sacrifice my child. Well, I better do it.
Right. And I think, again, we don't want to read too much into the text, that when someone would say, for example, from the text, it doesn't sound like Abraham is arguing at all. He's just doing it. I would say, well, be careful. The text doesn't get into that. We don't know the kind of conversations that Abraham had with Yahweh on the way, right, for those 3 days. And knowing that, Abraham said 1825, back in the story of Sodom, Abraham is quoted as saying, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" So the idea that at least this much Abraham knows about his deity. He is the creator. I think he knows it by now, that this deity runs the world. And I know I can trust him to do what is right. As hard as that word might be to me in my day-to-day obedience, it might call for a lot. I know that he's always right. So in that sense, and I love the title of the book, Abraham's Silence, because that is part of what has offended people for years. Especially, you can read atheists on this text and they're offended by a God who would actually ask for a man's son, right, to die. So, and I understand. I don't run from that as I read it even myself, but it is a shocking moment. And as we close up that question and move to another, I think our answer that we're both agreeing to, the best we can do, is say, well, he's coming from a religion or a culture in which child sacrifice was known. Even Hosea 6 verse 7, where or Micah 6 verse 7, where the prophet talks about, does God want me to, let me quote it because it's important to our story. Micah 6 verse 7, will the Lord Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams or 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Now that's, of course, with a implied no. The Yahweh does not need blood like that. He does not need it for expiation of sin. But the very fact he brought it up, that Micah would say that at the end of the Old Testament story, hints that the Israelite, knew what it was to kill your progeny for the sake of your soul. So I think by the time the trajectory of the story has moved from Genesis through the Old Testament, shall we say to Malachi or to Micah there, we know that Yahweh does not want blood for the sake of blood, and he's not out to kill, especially my child, for the sake of just death itself. So at least at this point in our story, and we go back to Genesis 22, which is very early, we'll give Abraham credit, and that's how Hebrews 11 will handle it. Credit for the obedience factor, not the wow factor, I guess I would call it. So, all right, verse 10, we ended with Abraham stretching out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. But, and here's verse 11, an angel of Yahweh. Now, again, the word angel there, it's messenger, malach in Hebrew. The reason we textually put in English the word angel there in place of messenger is, again, tradition, but also because it's from heaven. So our guess is that this is a divine being, and it's a messenger, and the word the is not there. So we always have to just, we've been through this, but there is no the malach of Yahweh in the Old Testament, because it's just textually impossible to put the word the in front of malach when it's matched up with Yahweh, a name. So we always have to read it just angel of Yahweh. Or I always, as I've said, I take the word angel out of my English vocabulary completely, and I just say messenger whenever I see the word angel. So I read it as this, verse 11. A messenger of Yahweh called to him from the heavens, that's in plural actually, and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Yes, what do you need, or what else? What is it? And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now and again I take it to be the messenger speaking as an agent for Yahweh, where they use the first person, I know that you fear, no article, Elohim. So you fear the being that has called you to do this. And I think that's why not just the Elohim, but just the concept, maybe if we want to take the article off for reasons of conceptualizing Elohim more as a placeholder than an actual person. I know that you now fear Elohim, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And the me again, spoken by a messenger, but speaking for Yahweh. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram, offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the place Yahweh will provide, Yahweh Yireh, as it is even to this day, showing again that editors have had their hand in this text. In the mount of Yahweh it shall be provided. I should stop and say anything you want to add into our story at this point, Mike.
I think that it's pretty explanatory that within the story itself. It is interesting that, I mean, because, just for the audience to remember, right? Like, I do wonder if the angel of Yahweh is the second power, but that's another conversation for another time as we move on. But I do understand your perspective as well, that this messenger is speaking on behalf of Yahweh, of the greater command. Like, don't do it. Do not do this.
Right.
But I do wonder.
Yeah, there's conversation to be had clearly going forward. I mean, we can dedicate an entire podcast to the second power in heaven, and I'd love to do it, especially in Mike's honor, right? Dr. Heiser's honor. So we'll get to that in time. The reader, the listener to this story would have envisioned a being, whether it's a second person, I guess you're getting into words that they wouldn't have applied to the story yet, but some being who's a messenger, clearly a messenger, right? It's not Yahweh, but it's a messenger, speaks up for Yahweh and does the talking for him as though he is Yahweh, right? He says, from me. So Let's talk about that. That question I had. Is there something special about this location? And the reason I bring it up is because we have had, we have had, I guess, back, I mentioned this in our study of Genesis 12 and 13, that Bethel, house of deity, house of God, house of a divine being, will seem to be a place it's called a gate of heaven, coming up in a later story. And the idea of, and that's because, again, this vision of a ladder with divine beings going up and down is part of that story, Genesis 28 and 35, that there are portals in the biblical stories where you have moments where heaven breaks protocol and talks to earth. It's not common, not every day. I live in a suburb of Minneapolis. I take walks, through my neighborhood every now and then. And I talk to God no less than you do, Mike, I'm sure. I mean, but I'm always fascinated that he doesn't talk back. He could so easily talk back to me, and he doesn't. And so I don't get Post-it notes. I don't get any objective voices in my head. And, that's another conversation. But there are biblical moments where someone yells from heaven, be it Yahweh himself at the baptism of Jesus, or here a malach yells down from heaven. And you get the feeling that, whoa, this place even might be special. And I would recommend, based on this story, that the concept of Jerusalem, the place where later in 1 Chronicles 21, David will be on this threshing floor and meet a divine being and so forth, and revere that spot because of some kind of, again, in his mind, this is a place where gods come or appear or come down. And so I just throw it out there as not a weird thing. I just recommend that the Bible is thinking in these terms, that Jerusalem, because of, again, Moriah now, Jerusalem will be somewhere, some place that in the story to come, and it does happen in Deuteronomy 12 and on, that Jerusalem seems to be the spot among others, but the spot eventually, that God likes to, quote, place his name, and that there will be something special about that place. So we've talked about that before, but I just throw that out there that, we are on a story here that does have Jerusalem in its sights. So,
yeah, and there is always that question. It's like, is this Moriah the same Moriah that would later appear in the Old Testament? I think specifically 2 Chronicles 3:1. But either case, I do think there is something very significant about the place, and that here we get into this conversation of like, are there places physically on earth that's the sort of the veil or the divide between the seen and unseen realms is maybe a little thinner, maybe a little bit more porous. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it's a good question to be had. And it's an interesting moment that, yes, very forcibly, this angel comes out, or this messenger comes out very clearly to Abraham, stop, do not plunge the knife.
Yeah. I mean, God could have led Abraham anywhere. Yeah. But in fact, he led him here. And then the story moves to where this place is where the angel yells from heaven. So the point is there the ability of God to speak to anyone at any time? We all say yes. But are there stories in the Bible that show there are certain places that it seems to happen more often than not, or that it happens more often than other places? And I would say Jerusalem seems to be one of them. So, and it's interesting to me, but nothing I can, prove.
I mean, I think
let's go on to 15. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, it would be also worthwhile, right? Because the other question that appears in my mind is that, well, God, he's described as the God at that moment, but in 22:1, God does speak to Abraham wherever location they are at that moment. So it's almost like, well, okay, what prevented you from, you could have done it here, though there is also possible, people might have stopped them. Let's go to a distant place. That those amount of 3 days, maybe there's some time to think and process for Abraham. It's just interesting, right? If people think only God can only speak to people at certain special places, and yet ironically in 22:1, God does speak directly to Abraham here. And it doesn't
Right.
seem to be any more special or any less special than Moriah. But there is something very significant about this location because of the event that would take place.
The phrase gate of heaven is used, and I think it's the Bethel location. So at least there, a gate of heaven. Interesting phrase.
Yeah.
All right. 15. Then messenger of Yahweh, and we say the messenger if we want. The messenger of Yahweh called Abraham a second time. So now they have a conversation. And he says, by myself, I, speaking, I believe, for Yahweh, have sworn, says Yahweh, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. In blessing, I will bless you. And in multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your enemies, your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. Let's pause there. Again, he's repeating to Abraham much of the promise that he gave him back in Genesis 12, but he's certainly adding that land element very clearly in there when he says, you will possess the gate of their enemies, or your enemies, your descendants. The idea that you're going to control the cities even of your enemies is a very powerful idea. That's a bit beyond what we got back in 12. Let's see if there's anything else I want to grab out of there. The idea, we mentioned this, that the stars concept may have both a quantitative, a many, and a qualitative, a great connotation. The idea that stars are the homes of the gods, that your descendants will be as stars. Numerous people have picked up on that, especially within the Divine Council worldview idea, that it's a hint at least that there is a qualitative promise that the descendants of Abraham will be deity-like in some sense, or at least be qualified on that level. So I'm fine with that. I think it's there. It's whether or not the original reader would have caught it, I guess, at the time. But I want to go to 18. In your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And notice how this verse ends. Because you have obeyed my voice. So that was one of my opening questions. Was Abraham's obedience required for his covenant with Yahweh to remain intact? In other words, was the Abrahamic covenant ever conditional upon his obedience? My recommendation, and I'll throw it open to you, Mike, is yes, that the conditional element of Yahweh and Abraham's covenant went both ways, that it was just presumed. That's how covenants work. Here's my point, is that covenants, even if it doesn't say it on the front end, to make a covenant with someone, whether it be a couple at the marriage, like their wedding, when you hear them give their vows, you are presuming, whether or not you caught it in the words they used, but you're presuming that this is a two-way street. And then if one of them gives up on the marriage, the other one, and this is quoting 1 Corinthians 7, Paul's kind of making a common sense point that when one person gives up on the marriage, the other person is free to go. They aren't held in the covenant if the other person breaks it. So I think what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 7 is, I think, able to be splashed backwards upon the whole biblical narrative of the concept of a covenant being implied forfeiture for either one if the other one breaks the covenant. So my point is that even though it says, because he has obeyed my voice now, and it wasn't put at the front end back in Genesis 12, I think this has been here the whole time, that this is always the implication of an Abraham who is being obedient to what he knows about his deity at that time, whatever part of the story we're in. So we're going to get this later to 26:5 in retelling to Isaac the story of his father. We have this, and we'll get to it in a later podcast, because Abraham, 26:5, Abraham obeyed my voice, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my Torah even. That kind of line is used because the whole time we've had a covenant that has been graciously offered and precariously, shall we say, kept by Abraham, in the sense that he knows he's under obligation to live up to his end as Yahweh is as well. So Any thoughts there? What I'm arguing against, I guess, and I'm hopefully doing it gently, but clearly, is that sometimes people, especially theologians, like to go to Genesis 12 and make it a purely unconditional covenant, as though Abraham wasn't expected to actually obey, that it was more just a covenant of what people call faith, a very general term at that point, and it becomes this very slippery, to me, odd idea of God coming to a man saying, well, and now I'm going to fill in words that I don't believe, but I'm going to make my point. It's as though people make Abraham hearing this covenant sound like, hey, guy, Abraham, I don't care what you do the rest of your life, you're mine. You're stuck with me. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you great, blah, blah, blah. And Abraham's looking up saying, well, what if I don't want to do this? And God's saying, this is not your call. This is mine. And I'm recommending, based on, here's my long point made short, based on 22:18, based on 26:5, even based on 18:19, earlier text, that there has been this presumed two-way street the whole time, and that Abraham is knowing that he's responsible to the deity that's called him, as much as, and here's a big thing, though, that I think in a divine council worldview we have to nail down, the idea that a deity would hold to his end of the bargain is pretty fascinating. Because again, in the world of the ancients, deities were notoriously bad at keeping deals with humans. They had no necessity laid upon them to be treating humans with covenantal love. That's just not how deities were understood. Mm-hmm. So the idea that Yahweh holds to his end of the bargain always, to me, is the fascinating part that we need to, preach from the rooftops here, and not the part that says Abraham has been just being unconditionally, found by this deity. So, any thoughts there?
I think what you're pointing out, or you're shedding a little bit more light on sort of the blind spot at times within Protestant or evangelical theology, right? That like what we intend to say is what you just pointed out, that yes, Yahweh is faithful and that he has this covenant love, that he still keeps his end of the bargain despite the consistent disobedience of his people. And in some sense, he's not obligated to continue, but he still does. And so that is something that we want to emphasize and we want to shout out to, on the rooftops, as he said. But I think in doing so, sometimes we then are tempted to denigrate or de-emphasize the importance of actual express loyalty, of right. Express allegiance, right? So to say, or to borrow a phrase from Matthew Bates, or believing loyalty, to use Dr. Heiser's phrase. That I think that is something that oftentimes we as Protestants or evangelicals, we have kind of forgotten, or we've made it into some sort of weird two-step thing where you have to mentally agree, and then because you mentally agree, you're going to now do an action because you mentally agree. Right. And instead of not realizing that the agreement and the action are embedded with one another, they are fused together. You can't really separate a choice, a mental choice, at the same time as being expressed through your body. Abraham obeyed. And why did he obey? Because he is expressing loyalty. His faith is in motion about Yahweh. And so I think that you're just simply pointing out something that sometimes is a blind spot for us. We want to try to emphasize greatly the love of Yahweh, but we sometimes, unfortunately, may denigrate or really de-emphasize the importance on our end of expressing allegiance to Yahweh.
Well, we're so afraid of works. And I think it's because of our Protestant Reformed background that every evangelical in America is, coming from that angle. In other words, if you're evangelical in America, you're basically coming out of a Protestant Reformation worldview where faith and works is, obviously, works is bad, faith is good. And then faith, based on that phrase, is put into this passivity moment where you're accepting something done for you as though that's what faith is. And what I've been recommending, and you're part of this too, is, and Mike was as well, that whoa. Faith is an active, aggressive idea in the Bible.
Yeah.
It's never passive. And so the idea of receiving something, if you want to call that faith, be really careful because, yes, Abraham received the promise. And this is one of the arguments of Galatians 4, which we'll get to in a couple of podcasts when we talk about Isaac, that being a child of the promise, Galatians 4:28, I'm specifically arguing at or thinking of now, can sometimes give us, when we hear the word promise, a passivity idea, that I was promised this, therefore it's going to come. And if as long as I believe in that promise, and notice what I've just done in those last 10 seconds, I've completely turned salvation into a passive, receptive idea. And that's why Matthew Bates got in trouble, shall we say, or at least had a lot of raised eyebrows when he called faith allegiance. And yet I think to his, and as we talk to him, to his credit and to those who take his view, all he's doing is unpacking the meaning of the term. It's just crazy how we have come to a point where, and it's almost conspiratorial in my mind, where you can turn a word in English against itself in its original meaning in Greek and Hebrew. So, but we've been through all that, but I just find it fascinating again that here's a spot in the text, 22:18, where the faith of Abraham is not passive. It's extremely aggressive. And I would recommend that's the paradigm to pull through the rest of Scripture so that when you get to the New Testament and you have people believing, John 3:16, believing in Jesus, it's going to be the same aggressive loyalty, allegiance, fidelity, fealty, whatever word you want to put there. It's going to be something that grabs on and doesn't let go of. So,
and if
verse 19, Abraham returned to his young men. Notice it just says Abraham, but we know Isaac came with him. So again, don't read into this too much. Abraham returned to his young men. They arose and went together to Beersheba, and he dwelt in Beersheba. So one more thought. Well, I want to make sure I covered our questions. Why would Yahweh tell a person to kill their son, as I recommended at this point in the story? And I like to use that illustration of standing on the side of a play. And you have your lines, you're ready to go in on stage. But before you go in on stage, you're watching other people before you play out their part of the play. And you're wondering, why do they say those lines? Those aren't my lines. I think that's a kind of illustration where you can say to people who you're watching give their lines in the Bible, well, that's in their part of the play. The writer, the director, they know what they're doing. When I get out there and I give my lines, they will sound different. And that's due to the story that the screenwriter, the director is telling. One thing I want to get to, I think we didn't get to the last one, but it is important, is the substitution portrayed here, what we just saw in 22. The great Akeda story, the binding of Isaac. Is the substitution portrayed here a possible, probable, even ideal meaning to give to Jesus' death on the cross? My quick answer to that would be no. And here's my argument. And again, I would love to hear your thoughts on the fly. I didn't tell you about this, Mike, so you're hearing it for the first time. Why would I not use this as a symbol for Jesus' death? 4 reasons. Number 1, the New Testament does not. Nowhere in the New Testament do they pick up a story that's right here for the taking. This is an incredible story to me that a New Testament person would use logically to think of what God did with Jesus. He substituted Jesus in place of me as the ram was substituted in place of Isaac. So my first point of not using this as a story about Jesus is one, the New Testament seems to be completely silent on the Akeda story. Number 2, the substitute in our story that we just finished is not required at the beginning of the story. Now, what I mean by that is think carefully. I'm talking to the audience, not you, Mike, but please, think carefully about what happened here. God doesn't start the day by saying, I need someone to die. I need someone to die. Okay, well, you take Isaac. And then in the story, okay, Isaac isn't, but okay, let's see, we got to get somebody, so we get, we get a ram. I know that sounds pedantic, the way I just said that, even coarse, but that's, again, what I'm trying to pull away from, that God doesn't start the story by saying, I need death. He starts the story by saying, I need commitment. And that's a hugely different outcome. So the point of him finding a ram at the end when you think about it, is not even God's need. It nowhere says in the story that God told, or the messenger never said, hey, go get that ram and you'll fulfill the need of Yahweh for blood. It just simply says he wants to do a burnt offering, happens to be his son on the altar. When the angel or the messenger says, don't kill your son, I think that the natural element of Abraham's faith at that point would be, I want to sacrifice to just show my loyalty to Yahweh, and there's a ram, I'll go get it. So to me, it's not a substitute, because like in baseball, you need a batter and the umpire doesn't care who it is, just so you have a batter. That's why you have pinch hitters. In this story, God is not needing a pinch hitter. We have a pinch hitter, but it's incidental to the main point of the story, which is commitment. Is that making sense?
It is making sense. It's kind of funny. I think maybe if you had asked me this question years ago, I might have been a little bit disturbed by your answer. I think
either I've gotten worse or you've gotten better, but yeah,
I don't know. Maybe we're converging, but what I do, partly the reason why I've moved away from just assuming or even wanting to say that this is somehow a connection back to Jesus, the Father, sacrificing his son, and it's just like Abraham and Isaac, is because I have come to question whether what Abraham did, though he is technically obedient, was this actually the test that Abraham was supposed to actually really ace, right? And my thoughts go back again to like how Middleton's exegetical work is just kind of left a lot of these interesting, like kind of ambiguous questions that I have in my mind. Right, because even when the angel, the messenger speaks again to Abraham, he quotes the thing that God said to Abraham at the beginning about, do this, do that, and the son whom you love. He does mention that, but in verse 16, this messenger, says almost the same words, but he excludes the words whom you love. It right. Could have been a great moment to repeat, to sort of like be an inclusio of like closing it out. But he doesn't. He doesn't include the phrase whom you love. So that's like, again, that to me is leading into some more of that tension of like what is going on in this story. And I know that you mentioned, and I do, logically, it makes sense that Isaac would come down with Abraham. But it is strange that the narrator goes out of the way to make sure that we know Abraham and Isaac went up to the mountain.
Yeah.
And then we only hear of Abraham. Logically, yes, Isaac would eventually have to come down from the mountain, but it's Abraham explicitly in the text that is said he returned to the Nahar, to the young men, and they returned back to Beersheba. Anyways, we can get more into that when we get into chapter 23 and 24 later on, but there's some ambiguity that makes me wonder what in the world's happening in the story now.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'll be glad to hear that. Let me quote a very quick quote from it's a Torah commentary written by Jews. Abraham's religion not only rejects the sacrifice of a son by a father, but rejects as well its use as a theological theme. So a Jewish commentator is saying, remember, our religion, Judaism, will never use this story to recommend child sacrifice, even as a theme. And then he says this interesting point in the commentary here. This is in stark contrast to Eastern religions and to Christianity, in which a father's sacrificial gift of his son plays an important role. Jews are not lost on the fact that Jesus is sacrificed in the theological world of Christianity. Christians have historically been understood to say that Yahweh sacrificed his son for the world. Now, again, we can deal with the precarious use of those very words if we want to later, but Judaism will look at this and say, yeah, I know Christianity will use this theme. Judaism will look at it and say, here's where we differ. We don't take Genesis 22, to have any theological importance as far as what a father can do to his son, whereas Christians, in their mind, do take it that way. And here's my last point then. as to why I would not use this as a symbol for Jesus' death. And I know I'm just throwing a lot at you here, but this will be something to, again, for fodder for future podcasts maybe. The idea, my fourth point is that here, the idea of Jesus' death being a sacrifice takes time in the New Testament story. In other words, think about this logically or even textually. Coming out of the Matthew 26 moment of Jesus' death, nobody looks at someone else and says, hey, that's a sacrifice. Yahweh sacrificed his son. In other words, nobody says it right off the bat because I think they were all horrified by the death of Jesus. And no one was putting together a theological string of thoughts that had them saying to themselves or anyone else, this is Yahweh's sacrifice of his son, right? They didn't, I'm just being honest with the text. Nobody at the early, late Matthew or early Acts sees that. But what they do, in fact, in other words, Jesus doesn't die at the tabernacle or temple. It would have really helped to get that illustration if he does die. Let's say he was cleansing the temple and they kill him. I could see the sacrifice motif coming out quicker there. But the fact that he's killed outside of the temple area, literally in a cemetery or in an unclean place, breaks all norm for what we would call a biblical sacrifice anyway. And so that's why Jews are always horrified by the Christian idea that Jesus is a sacrifice. Jews will say, number one, we don't sacrifice people, in Deuteronomy 12. And number two, he didn't die at the temple, where you have to go, Leviticus 17, you've got to take the blood to the tabernacle or the temple. So they have good reasons for denying the sacrificial, and I'm using that word very carefully, the sacrificial death of Jesus, because Yahweh had told us numerous ways that you sacrifice and Jesus does not meet those requirements. Eventually, here's my last point though. Here's what I think happens in the New Testament that I do think Genesis 22 works on a certain level. When you get to Ephesians 2, verses 12 and 13 particularly, you get this idea, I think it's a midrashic spin that Paul is putting into the story that, well, I really owe it to everyone to read it. Ephesians 2, 12 and 13. At that time you, the Gentiles listening to him in Ephesus, were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. There's a good use of the idea of Gentile. You're alien from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenant of promise. What was said to Abraham doesn't count for you. Here's what a Gentile was in the days of Paul, having no hope and without theos in the world. Without the theos, I think the article is there. In other words, you have your own theoi, but you don't have the theos because you're a Gentile. And then 13, but now in Christ Jesus, you who once were afar off, i.e. Gentiles, have been made near by the blood of Christ. There is a sacrificial reference, a blood of Christ moment where something happens in the story in Paul's mind where now, in this case, the Gentile is brought physically into nearness to Yahweh. He repeats it in 3:6. So my quick point would be, and this is a whole podcast in itself, if not more than that, but the idea of Jesus' sacrifice as a theme, I think takes time. It takes about a generation. It takes about from 30 to 60 AD, if Ephesians written in about 60. Takes that long for Christians like Paul to think through all the dots that are being connected and all the, shall we say, the fishing line that they're pulling through the Old Testament and what catches on the hook, what pulls through the Old Testament and finally makes sense in the New is, I think, finally, this is one of the last ideas that they pull out of the death of Jesus, is the idea of a sacrifice. It takes time because there are so many, well, again, things that don't match up when it comes to sacrifice of Jesus. And so it took some time, and you get to Hebrews 13 where he dies outside the gate, and they acknowledge that as being a reason to go to him, right? Ephesians 13 or Hebrews 13, like in verse 21, I think it is. Let us go to him outside the gate. It seems to be that call of, okay, now we can make sense of Jesus dying as a sacrifice, but it appends the whole concept to us of what it meant to really be a sacrifice in the Levitical sense. It has to work in kind of a midrashic spin that takes a lot of work. And I think it takes about 30 years of work, frankly, in the mind of the New Testament writer. But anyway, I threw a lot at you there. Any thoughts before we close it up for the day?
I'm curious. Have you ever had a chance to read of David Mitchell's Messiah Ben Joseph book?
No.
So Dr. Heiser had him on the podcast before. Actually, I think he had him for like two main episodes to talk about, two of his major works. I read through the Messiah Ben Joseph book, and it's him chronicling essentially from the biblical text all the way. He goes past even eventually. He kind of matches up this material that's related to the teaching within Judaism about Messiah Ben Joseph. What was drawn from the biblical text, eventually to early Second Temple materials, past that, and then eventually into the medieval rabbinic periods. One interesting thing that he noted was that the Messiah Ben Joseph figure, there was this concept that developed over time where this idea of, is it possible for a really, really righteous person to die and for that righteousness of that person to be actually accounted for or spread upon the entire people of God?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a Maccabean verse. I mean, the death of Judas Maccabeus and things like that. They were talking in intertestamental terms, Maccabees, of the idea of a martyr doing it for the sake of the nation. If not even John 11, Caiaphas seems to say something that draws the writer to make this comment that one would die for the nation.
Yeah.
Right?
And so that was part of his work, and it's a very interesting. I enjoyed it. It's a very interesting tie-in to at least a lot of the kind of the mental world, at least, especially when he was talking about the biblical and then the Second Temple period that was like more relevant to the time period of the biblical text in the New Testament. It is interesting to kind of realize there was this interesting concept that was floating around that the Messiah Ben Joseph figure was going to be seen as a very righteous person. And then somehow in the story, this person would die. And this death would somehow be accounted for as righteousness or martyrdom, I guess, in this way for the people.
Yeah. Cool.
So anyways, that's just a thought. And like I said, we can definitely talk a little bit more later on of the interesting little note of how the messenger does not say whom you love back to Abraham towards the end. And just locations. Like there's something going on with their actual physical locations after this story that makes me wonder.
Okay. Well, let's do that next time. Yeah. In fact, let's lead off next time with that question of why that might have been, because then we can handle the end of 22 is 5 verses about the family of Nahor, and that really ties us into chapter 23 anyway. So I'm going to hang on to the end of the 22 to begin 23 next time. So let's do that. All right. Sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening in and appreciating with us this great story of Abraham and Isaac. Again, the point being the commitment of a man to his deity. We cannot lose sight of that, and I hope we don't. So until next time, thank you.